get the investment of a big campaign donor. She'd given $2.8 million to Republicans since 1998, and that included $130,000 to the school's superintendent himself. From Florida, which has spent literally billions of dollars on charter schools, we learned the problem that comes from turning schools over to for-profit management. And that's been a problem in several schools, including Ohio, Pennsylvania, and several others. In Florida, they have kept school districts from policing the schools, the charter schools within their boundaries. In fact, Miami-Dade County found it was powerless to shut down the Blair Language Academy, even when the charter school's management was supplementing the money it got from the state by using that building as an adult club for boozy parties with women in thong bikinis on the weekend, and with 9 7th graders, their classroom was a storage shed. And if you want to see the flyers, they're great, but you have to be 18. From Pennsylvania and many other states, we learned the problems that come from lax oversight of shady real estate deals involving charter schools. It's one reason with the industry, in addition to hedge fund managers, most interested in charter schools is the real estate business. Here's one way the scam can work. There was a fellow named Vaughn Garagian, and he had a building that he owned, he put on the market. A nonprofit organization bought his building for $50 million. All of that was funded with municipal bonds. So the taxpayer was on the hook for that. That organization then leased the building to the charter school, which by some strange coincidence hired a for-profit management company run by none other than Vaughn Garagian. So not only did he make money off selling the building, but he was making money every month from running the charter school. You will not be surprised that Mr. Garagian is a big campaign donor. He was the biggest donor to Pennsylvania Governor Tom Corbett. And if you think education doesn't pay, that's his Palm Beach mansion. It's worth $84 million. He's got another one in Pennsylvania, but it's not quite as nice. In other cases, the real estate scam works like this. The charter school and the real estate company work in tandem. The real estate company buys a building for not a lot and then rents it at an exorbitant rate to the charter school. Again, in Pennsylvania, this was another case. There was a string theory as a charter school in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, that paid more in rent, as you can see there, than it spent on teachers' salaries. They were so pressed because of their rent that they ended up dropping French classes, creative writing, and bus service, because they couldn't afford it anymore. Independence Charter School bought an old elementary school, so the public had already bought this school once. They paid $18 million for it, using a municipal bond, of course, so that the taxpayer could have the privilege of paying for it yet again. This happens in numerous states. This is not just Pennsylvania. By the way, Pennsylvania, like Ohio and Florida, is a hotbed of charter school scandals. 19 of Philadelphia's 84 charter schools were under investigation in 2011. That's nearly 1/4, and that's only 1 year. So from Florida and Ohio, we also learned about how having elected officials, agency chiefs, and their families using their elected and appointed positions to advance their and their family's charter school business interests. And that's been a particularly big problem in Florida. That's the, I can't remember, he's the state Senate Majority Leader or the House Majority Leader. Oh, so he's the House Majority Leader, sorry. In California, we learned that students in what happens when students in charter schools do not have the same rights as students in public schools. A judge there ruled that students in charter schools do not have due process rights. Why not? Because they always have the option to go back to the public school, where once again they have all their civil rights, including their due process rights. This is like saying, you know what, in Louisville, you don't need your civil rights, because you know what, you can move to Shelbyville. Well, you'll have them again. By the way, this is why the committee feels so strongly that any charter schools established in Kentucky should have SBDMs. Those are school-based decision-making councils, as well as open meetings and open records. We learned something from Massachusetts and New York, and that is what happens when schools are allowed to cherry-pick their students and reject students with disabilities, English language learners, and students with ADHD. In one charter school in Massachusetts, the senior class had half as many students as when they were freshmen. That's because they spent their time pushing those students out, and the charter's not required to replace them with other students. One Boston charter school had suspended 60% of its students, clearly an attempt to persuade their parents to enroll them someplace else. In New York City, charter schools are just 7% of the school population, but they're 42% of New York City's suspensions. Increasingly, charter schools across the country have enabled the resegregation of schools, making a mockery of Brown versus the Board of Education. The UCLA-based Civil Rights Project examined charter schools in 40 states and the District of Columbia in 2010. As you'll see, 70% of African American children in charter schools attend a school that is 90% black or greater. That's twice as many as in public schools. Half of Latino children in charter schools attend a school where the student population is 90% or more Latino. These are a lot of pitfalls we've gone over, and schools aren't like, private businesses. When the Samsung Galaxy Notes started blowing up, a few people were burned, a lot of people were frightened, but the damage was not long lasting. When charter schools blow up, at best, children lose years of instruction. And at worst, their life chances are totally ruined. We like to say that we value children. This is our time to show we need it. It'll be easier for everybody to hear you.
One answer, there are a range of state laws that do different things. There are a range of local arrangements that do different things. So the heart of the Pritchard report is the 8 questions on that handout that was pointed out a little while ago. I brought this to give you the meat of the report. I brought about 20 copies of the whole report, but it's available at the Pritchard Committee's website. If anyone didn't get copies, I didn't want to burn more trees than people actually wanted copies for. So I bought some, knowing some people don't want to go hunting at the website. But I wanted to talk you through a few of the key points in thinking about each of these questions. Starting with what student results is a charter held accountable for. When charter schools started, most states did not have a full-scale accountability system. That became common with No Child Left Behind. And at that point, all states added some version of that. If Kentucky adds charter schools, Kentucky charter schools will be subject to Kentucky's accountability rules, with the note that, of course, we're changing those rules because No Child Left Behind has been replaced by the Every Student Succeeds Act. But and Kentucky has a bunch of flexibility about how we do that accountability, but one thing that's settled is all the schools you list as public schools, including your charter schools, are going to be subject to those rules. States have options of adding some additional things. In the original explanation of charters, there was a notion that charters could get some more things done for kids. So Kentucky could have rules that say charter schools need to tell us what extra value they're going to add. That's a genuine option for the state. But that's also something you're going to want to watch, just the statewide accountability discussions, you know what the minimum is, and watch any bill that gets proposed to see if there's charter schools. Second issue that comes up is we keep saying charter schools get flexibility. What flexibility? And again, there are options. Almost everyone will say charter schools are subject to the rules for health, safety, non-discrimination, and maybe something about transparency. But that doesn't fill that. I live inside the Kentucky statutes. I don't really recommend it as a vacation home, but I do live inside them and spend a bunch of time. When I heard that, I immediately thought, which things fit which side? And that's why I brought the table on the back as an illustration of approximately what's going to be at stake when Kentucky has an argument about what's going to be required and what isn't. On the blue side of that column on the left are a set of state rules that public school folks are very used to living under that I think probably fit. Those are room for debate. That health, safety, non-discrimination, public transparency kind of categories. On the other side, a whole set of things that are precious to some folks involved in public education that maybe don't fit. And the point of the chart isn't to give a definitive answer if this is the right way to do it, but to tee up the issue. I think probably within this room we could probably get a good debate going on. Is the 2% contingency a reasonable requirement for good management of public money, on the one side? And on the other side, is it right for kids to let schools out of identifying gifted children and making plans to meet their needs? So sort of from the bottom of the one chart to the top of the other, you can see things that I think a Kentucky debate is going to talk a bunch about what should we move back and forth. And that one, folks, to see the range of what could be at stake there. I will mention that in the middle of that green chart on the right, I think I've got every major education bill sponsored by Republicans in the last 10 years. And that's on the green, let's not do it anymore side of what might happen with charter schools. So the concern about kids doing physical activity, the concerns about offering college-ready courses. In the most flexible versions of what charter schools might be required to do, those things would not be required, even though they've been a great concern to some of the folks who are also advocating for charters. So that's a thing to see coming. Once you get past that, the next really big question is how do students end up at charter schools? How are they assigned or admitted? In that conversion charter model, it might be a school opening up in a building that already had a student population and the kids are still there. But the more common version of charters, they're startups, they're starting in a new building, they don't have past students, there's some admissions process. It's fairly common to say if there are more kids want to come than the school has space for, it's going to be done by a lottery. That is not guaranteed by saying this is a charter school. It's not guaranteed by saying we're passing a charter law. Deciding that charters have to use a lottery to decide who can come is something that either will or won't be in a Kentucky statute, and I think it's a very important thing to watch for. Going with that, lotteries fairly often have some preferences. A preference for siblings of kids who are already there, possibly a preference for kids who can add diversity to the school, possibly a preference for kids who are in schools that have had troubled results in the previous years. So there again, you want to watch who's getting those special opportunities. And you might watch for, do the kids all need to come from the same district or can they come from the whole surrounding area? And how is transportation going to work if kids are coming from a broader space? Then to move to the big definition, the charter has those two sides to it. So the question, who's going to authorize it and who can apply to run one, are going to be important. States vary on that. The most common arrangement is local school boards decide and authorize the charters. Some states have universities able to authorize. Some states have their state board doing the authorization. 8 states have a special state agency set up to make those decisions. And that's another thing if you're opening up a charter bill to say what's happening here. Is that still a local decision? Is it moved up to the state? Can some other institutions step in and approve charters is something you really want to know to understand the design. On the other side, who can apply to run a charter school? Some states say only nonprofits, and I feel utterly confident that you're going to hear about how it can say nonprofit and not quite work that way. I've heard the stories, but I thought I'd defer to the full panel to have some sense of how that might not be applicable. Some states allow for-profits to apply. Some states say you have to be incorporated as a nonprofit before you can open your doors. But you can apply not having set up what your corporate governance is going to be and not having asked the federal government to recognize you as a nonprofit. I do want to mention there's a distinctive thing in Kentucky's Constitution, because there's a classic question, can a faith-based organization apply to run a charter school? Most states in the country, you would start talking about the First Amendment to figure that out. In Kentucky, our Constitution, Section 189, says, I'm going to read it to you. Right. No portion of any fund or tax now existing or that hereafter may be raised or levied for educational purposes shall be appropriated to or used by or in aid of any church, sectarian, or denominational school. So I do think one thing we know is that door is locked. People may try to come through it, but I think the structure is there. That goes back to when Kentucky had really ugly Catholic-Protestant wars going on. And I don't entirely mean wars metaphorically, if you know our history. But that piece will end with the rules that no parent shall be required to send a child to a school. The parent is not approved of. And that was clearly a deal made a long, long time ago. Couple other issues. Will there be caps on the number of charters or rules about how many charters there can be? Classic forms of limitations are what size district can have them, usually tilted toward very large ones. Don't know if there's a district, you're in it. Sometimes there are limits on how many schools total can be open. Sometimes there are limits on what percent of a district's population can be enrolled in the charter schools, and that's a thing to look for. 19 states have no caps. So you don't know there are going to be caps except by looking through the law and finding here's where it says the limits. Question 7, I think, is the really heavyweight. How will charter schools be closed if they don't deliver? You could write the law to say if you don't meet this level of goal, you're closing. Every state says multiple years. And that's not a problem because there are kids in a troubled school. But it's a problem in any way trying to set up education because school change isn't usually a 3-month process. It's almost always a deeper process of building a culture that's going to work for the kids. I will add as a statistic that from 92 to 2011, roughly 6,700 charters opened and more than 1,000 closed. 19% of those were for academic reasons, not delivering what they said they would do for kids. 42% for financial reasons, 24% for mismanagement, and then the balance was a combination of other things like running out of facilities, and occasionally there isn't a record of why the school disappeared. Final question of the 8 questions is what funding will charter schools receive? There are a fair number of places where that's negotiated between the local school board and the charter school. And that's a negotiation that'll be sort of like the Middle East. Right? That's always, all parties are always saying the other guy got a better deal. But that happens. And if you're running an innovative school within the school system, you're also in those negotiations. What are we going to get? There's also an option for approval formulas. Kentucky's shining star of funding equalization is the big seat formula. That gives an impression at the first level that you can figure out what's the fair amount of money. I think it will be more difficult than it looks at first glance. And the big reason is because SEEK is built on both state and local money. Every district in the state has made a voluntary decision to tax itself more than the minimum 30 cents. Most districts in the state have made a decision to tax themselves so much more that the state stops equalizing it. So if you want to talk about charter funding, you can either do what the state guarantees, which will be way less than most schools run on, or you can set up rules that say local dollars that were set up by people to run their public school system are going to have to flow to charter schools. The other thing to watch for there is, because not all dollars are equalized, districts have different amounts of funding per pupil. So if you put together a charter school and kids are coming from Jefferson and Bullitt and Shelby, that may be different amounts of money flowing in from the different students, and that's going to be a thing that's going to be a lot of discussion if we go there at all. Two other issues really quickly. Facilities funding comes from a separate stream in Kentucky. And the decision is always, it's a 30-year investment to decide to borrow to build a school. So there's going to be a complicated discussion about how you arrange to have those really not growing on trees buildings that'll hold 150 kids in 6 different rooms where 30 kids have room to move around, with sprinklers and tornado shelter and a good plan for a live shooter situation. And I certainly hope some room for the kids to run around and bounce up and down and get some exercise. That's not an easy thing to find. The charter advocates will say we're being cheated because there's never enough for facilities. Everyone else will say you're being expensive because you always need more for facilities. It actually, and I think this is true internationally, I did some reading years ago on systems in other countries. And in the ways they offer parental choice, everybody's always fighting about facilities too. And the other issue that's going to be really intense is going to be state-funded employee benefits, because it's going to be a problem if the schools get to take the money and not put it in the benefits program. And it's going to be a noise if they're told this is what you've got to put up out of your budget, or watch the state move into this benefit system. It's a fundamental solidarity question of whether everybody rises and falls together, or whether people are going to peel off and do things separately. And given the challenges we've had with our pension system, that's not small. I do want to close with the briefest note on the research on charter schools. The Pritchard study relied pretty heavily on the Credo study, which looked at students who came from different, similar backgrounds. They were called virtual twins. So they were looking for students of very similar demographic backgrounds who started out doing work at about the same level. And when they went through and then looked at performance later on compared to charter students and the non-charter students, they found very little impact for students overall. When they broke it out further, they found an important looking impact, though you can argue about whether the study was conducted perfectly. Their data looks like for African American students going to a charter school can be an important plus. For low income students, it can be a plus. For Hispanic students, if they come from low income families, charter schools can be a plus. For white students, charter schools are a net loss. And that's worth noting in the data. It looks neutral across the board if you break it out. There's some benefits, sometimes there's losses for some other groups. And there's a separate set of studies that I've been reading in the last week that look at students who won and lost charter lotteries. So they're similar in that their parents went to all the work to apply, and some of them ended up at a charter and some didn't. They have some similar findings. They didn't look at demographics directly, but they said, we're seeing some important gains for kids in urban charters, not anywhere else. So this is nobody's panacea, and then you can debate whether you're convinced by the argument for some populations, but it's not a brilliant market-based miracle where the fact that charter schools exist gets you some growth and achievement. I will admit, when I first heard the concept, I thought charter schools were set up to smoke everybody else, because the initial concept was the people founding it believe heartily in what they're doing, the teachers are there because they believe in this particular model, the parents send their kids because they believe in the model. So my recurring question to charter advocates is, so how come the data is ambiguous? Right? That sounds like you've got some things that would work well for kids. The data is ambiguous unless you break it down to that population level. And I think even then there are critics who will say that's not fully convincing. But on the other hand, there are people who will say very firmly, I see my kids as needing a kind of school that works very differently, and charters look like a way to get that to happen. And you can look at the studies and say, yes, for these groups of kids, past charters have shown they can do something. So that's my whole pitch. I will look forward to questions, but not until after you've heard the other two presentations.
Well, we've sort of gone back to an imbalance now. And this notion that charter schools, as Susan said, is this panacea for what ails our public schools, I think is not a true statement. If this were the fix for what how we could address our achievement gaps, we would have done it already. Educators would have been the one to say, let's start a charter school today. I need a charter school to fix the achievement gap. But that's not how you fix it. We have lots of issues. Budgets are tight now. Most school districts can't even send their students on a field trip without having to ask parents for money, get donations, write a grant. That's the most practical. We're seeing what kind of jobs they need, and will that interest you? You know, not all learning is just standing up and listening. We have to engage kids. We have to give them experiences, and we can't do that now. We have a shortage of bus drivers and substitute teachers in this state that is at a crisis tipping point. Teachers are going to school sick. Bus drivers are driving sick because there's no one to do their jobs. That's a huge financial burden because it's costing, there's health care costs, there's transportation costs, which the state doesn't reimburse school districts for 100% of their transportation costs, and they can't keep up with new school buses. There's compounding problems that all go into what makes a great school experience. It's not just one little thing. It's not just a phrase, a charter school, that's going to fix what ails our students. What ails our students is time for learning, time for exercise, time for moving and to experience and to learn the things that they can do well, and to identify where they're not doing well and have the resources and the materials that they need, those practitioners, to accomplish those goals. And so a lot of what just the factual kinds of things have already been said, and I'd much rather engage with you in conversation and answer your questions. But it's hard to talk about what a charter school in Kentucky might look like because there's not been a bill yet, to my knowledge, unless you've seen one. No,
I'm sure we'll see plenty.
I'm sure we'll see plenty. But depending on exactly what's in that bill, it's hard to argue. It's hard to say what might be better. But I think the tools that you have here, and I think if we can just educate you on the right questions to ask and engage in your representatives and ask those questions, because ultimately what lacks in a lot of public charter schools is accountability. And the fact of the matter is that if your public tax dollars are going to a public institution, you should have the right to question what's going on in that institution. You should have a site-based council in that institution. Parents are a part of that site-based council. Parents and teachers and administrators and sometimes students, where they put students on their councils, they all have the right now to do innovative things, to be creative with their budgets. You know, in Jefferson County, Fayette County, there's so many innovative programs and all over the state, really, that, in my personal opinion, I don't feel like charter schools is the answer. I think there's other ways that we can address achievement gaps that are smarter than wasting time with lots of layers of bureaucracies from private corporations. Charter schools most of the time can't afford, like was said, with facilities. Extracurricular activities are almost non-existent because they can't afford them. They don't have the facilities to entertain them. They don't have the extra money to pay people to staff them. And so if those kinds of things are important to students, where do they go back to? The traditional public school. So I just think that there's, it's a complicated issue that, you know, I believe in public schools with all my heart. That's what I do. And I hope that you do too, and I just implore you to ask questions of the people in our government that think that this is something that non-educators should be deciding. Right? There's a handful of people who are educators or retired educators in the legislature. they have a right to say how education should be because they've done it. And that's not to offend anyone that's that's not an educator, but we spend a lot of time trying to learn and educate ourselves on how to educate the children of this nation, and we rarely get asked on how to do it or how to improve it.
That's my entire campaign.
So that's what I'm for you to do, and I appreciate the invitation, and I hope we can engage in some more conversation later. So thank you.
Well, things. So first of all, there are some contextual things you should know about Iowa and Kentucky. First, in many respects, they're very similar. Mostly rural state, but a few urban, 300 students total. But we've had a law since 2002. So how can that be? And the law is still on the books. It's because, in many respects, in Iowa, there were some fundamental, not just in name only because they receive public funds. If they were going to receive public funds, they would be public schools. They'd be public in every way, shape, and form. So the law was written that way. So it wasn't, oh, hey, we got to find some way of being fast and loose with everything, and then, here, give me some money to do it. But rather, the public purpose of schools, the public mission, the public trust, public accountability, all was written into the law. And because of that, at first, people were very afraid. I remember fighting against this law, but once it took place, because of the influence that was exercised in the writing and the care and the sort of precision of it, they had even had, well, we're going to have a cap of 10. There'd be at most 10 per year that could go forward from the state. And at this stage, the highest amount of charters there was ever in the state of Iowa was in 2008, and they got up to 8. Even when they even pulled off the caps. Oh, it must be the caps. Well, it couldn't have ever been the caps because they never had even 10 applied. And part of this, and so this is the part that I want folks to hear. I'm not saying that this can automatically happen here, but if they can, these are the things to push for. Number one, school boards are the ones that grant charter authorization, local school boards in Iowa. Not from some other standing group. So all those things as possibilities that Susan talked with you about, but she's right. There are all different kinds of ways that these can be done. But it matters. If you have, for example, just this standalone organization at the state level, appointed by our governor or something, that's going to be a very different kind of thing. And while there are some strictures, and so that's also a thing to know too. Every state is different because of like their state constitution. So certain areas we hope should be that might be possible in other states may not be here with regard to like non-sectarian and those kinds of things. There are some things that way that help make a boundary, right, with regard to certain things. There are other things that are really about our choices. And so making sure that these really are publicly accountable through the public mechanisms that we use. We have duly elected school boards in Kentucky, and that's how those things work. And I would also argue if the SBDM law and so forth, I think those kinds of things should apply. So all those kinds of tethers really matter. The other thing is that all the other ways that there were some types of public kind of tethers, those things were put in the Iowa laws as well. So that if there were federal, state, local laws, all those, everyone was subject to those. And because those public schools were the ones that granted the charter and the ones that could revoke the charter and the ones that had to be appealed to every year and given a presentation to every year, then that meant that everyone that was hired at that public charter school was a public school employee and a public district employee. They all also could be part of teachers' unions. They were part of the state's pension system. So in many respects, in fact, the law title in Iowa is called Charter Schools and Innovation Zone Schools. So I hear we have this like districts of innovation kind of thing here. So it's sort of treated that way in Iowa. And so because of that, all those same kinds of things applied. In terms of having these EMOs or others that would come in, those actually were prohibited in the Iowa law, that you could contract with folks outside of. And so that also is something that was a helpful provision, because they were not going to be a conduit to privatization. So these were going to be for public, for creating public citizens and done by public. So they wrote in the law too how you could apply. It had to come from at least 50% of the parents and 50% of the teachers at the school in order to be able to go with your application. If you can't just go and apply, you have to have that if you are trying to convert a school. And if you're trying to create a school, you also have to have that same kind of population, or be able to show that kind of base, I guess, of support when they go to the school board in order to apply. Finally, I would say that with regard to school districts that were very small, in Iowa, what they did have was the provision for districts to go together. And so those were called innovation zones. So you could have 2 or 3 districts go together, and they would be a zone, and that they could themselves have, and it would operate like a bigger district, and still the same kinds of things went forward. With regard to, let's see if there's other things. Oh, one of the things I think that is, it's kind of sleight of hand, that our publics forget about all the other results in terms of how kids grow and develop in schools. And I think that that's also a problem here to look at for public charter schools as well, in that I think that the challenge is less upon let's try them, and only if they work with their results, then they may or may not be okay. In Iowa, they said no, they have to be about the right purpose. They have to be about being inclusive. They have to offer special education. They have to be able to have all these different kinds of things in order to what kids get and what they need and what they deserve. It wasn't the shift that's happened in our kind of our perspectives to just say something's good if the results are there. And often those results are quite narrow. So I would also argue that here in Kentucky, as this possibility comes before us, that we should not wait and talk and worry mostly about, well, which ones and which models across the country have the right results. That's the wrong question. That is the wrong question. Don't look at the results. Look at the intent. Look at the purpose. The places where public charter schools are still about being about helping human beings grow for a public purpose, for well-rounded, whole children, then those are the places and states that you should look at. And Iowa's not the only one. There are several other states that have very tightly written public charter school laws in order to make sure that schools stay about the purpose for public education, that they make sure that kids are entitled to getting all the kinds of advantages that public schools bring. And if you look only at the results, which one was fast at getting their scores up, likely a bad metric, and then follow that, we're going to miss the point here. And so I hope that, and I certainly will take questions along with everyone else about things, but I think it's really important to not play the game about results and to really look at how things are organized, what purpose are they there for, and what kinds of ways that schools are put together. In Iowa, they have to be all about the same financial reporting and so forth, because they go right through the school district. So that's why it's the same. So there's no way that they can sort of get around things. And those charter schools then aren't really looked upon as bad then in some respects, because there's just like we would look at our innovation school. So I don't know that they're needed. I'm not for them, but I want to make sure that I'm for good schools. And good schools will be about these public purposes and about these ends, and not just try to get test score results up. The last thing I guess I would say is this, and it's a thing about not only making sure you look at the front end of charters and how you apply and how you create all the laws and things like that, not the back end results. But I've tried to do this a lot, and I don't do it as well as I should. But I think you should never say the words charter schools without putting the word public in front of it. I think you need to marry those, because if you want to be about a law that's for private charters, just like for private schools, I don't have a problem with private schools. Don't accept any public money. But if you are going to accept public money, then you should be about the public purpose, the public trust, public accountability, and all the other things that come with being public. So by marrying it over and over, I hope we don't even see a law that will say charter schools. If we see one, I hope it will say public charter schools. And then it has to go in accordance with all those things we think are really important to hold dear for not only public education, but for every human being and citizen that we pay our hard-earned tax dollars to be an investment in. That should not be given to some other group that's committed to not public things, just using that money for whatever it's thing. So the authorizing group matters. I hope it will be our local school boards.
The cards for questions?
We have them right here.
Okay, you can start. Yeah, you can start.
Oh, to Alan Young. What do Iowa charters offer different than other public schools? And why would public schools choose to be converted into a charter school?
Well, in many cases, they are just really nothing different. That was the purpose on the front end. I will say this, but this is also typical here. In some states, there is not the ability for folks to move around. And I know that there are people who will love neighborhood schools and not love neighborhood schools, but the point is, in many places where there are only neighborhood schools, there becomes, people want to romanticize that, but in many of those places, people are stuck also with their neighborhood schools, and there's not a lot of movement. So in Iowa, as well as in Kentucky, there is possibilities for movement, at least in Jefferson County there is. And in Iowa, there was open enrollment as well, even not just within school or districts, between districts. So there was a lot of movement already. So because there have been so much push for magnet schools, theme schools, innovation schools, and that was in Iowa as well, and here, I don't think there's a lot of difference that they offer. The main difference, and this is why those are all really confusing as innovative schools, right? And it's ironic that sometimes a charter school might be a traditional school. Well, how innovative is that? But the notion is that it is the difference between a charter school and all those other kinds of schools is the charter. It's the charter. The charter means I'm going to put the thing in the group of hands of some other group. And in Iowa they said, no, you're not. You're going to still put it in the school board's hands. So there really wasn't a difference. In other places that could go to another group, an arts foundation. I mean, well-meaning groups or things like that. But they would have a different public purpose, wouldn't they? And that's the difference. So that's why I say it's really important how you craft that law, but otherwise there's really not that much difference. They can be very innovative, and they're public, and we can be innovative and public. just the charter that's different.
So, is that why there are only 3 now instead of more? Because they're not that different?
I think that, first of all, there were a lot of people who wanted them who were pushing an ideology and thought they would be way different. But when you actually ask the really hard questions, and it's really why it's all about the questions, you know, who will authorize them? So Susan's got some of those right questions, you know, what kinds of things, will there be caps, all these different things, but less on the means. See, we have to have the purpose questions up front. What are these there for? And if you can get those be part of the conversation, it makes for a different law and it makes for a different result. There was not a lot of places that could really offer something different that couldn't be found in our public schools. A few places in rural places, there's no doubt that they felt they were stuck, and so 3 or 4 districts would go together and come up with something that they could get more resources for and try something new. And so that ends up being maybe an appetite for it. And there are no caps. As many people want to can apply. The other part is that when a group realizes I'm going to have to do all the same things that public schools do, I have to take the same kind of financial disclosure laws and all these other things, because those aren't red tape, those are safeguards with our public money. That when I'm going to have to do all of those things too, it's a lot of work for not much difference.
This is a question for somebody smarter than I. Does ALEC have a standard charter school bill that they dole out to state legislators? I would be surprised if they didn't. Is that what is likely to be proposed here, and what are its provisions?
Tell people what you used a name.
ALEC is the, I forget what they stand for.
American Legislative Exchange Council.
They're funded by the usual suspects.
Koch brothers.
The Koch brothers. And it's all about, you know, people should be getting money out of the state without really having to give back to the people who are paying them.
All right, any of you can answer. Want to speak to that? Susan, you want to speak to that?
I would join the ALEC almost certainly has a recommendation. I would say, having looked at the charter bills that were filed in the last 2 sessions, they looked to me like they had a bunch of Kentucky customization, as though legislators were in fact sitting down and thinking about some Kentucky issues as they wrote them. I have occasionally seen a bill come rolling through. I have seen bills roll through before where the people advocating for them would not take questions and would not consider any amendments. And I was pretty sure I knew what was happening. But the charter discussion seems at least a little more open than that, even among the very zealous advocates. There's a little more room to discuss than we're now doing what our overlords have specified. It's more like a Kentucky discussion than that.
I want to ask Representative Marsden, what can you tell us about what's been proposed in the legislature?
Well, we don't know what's coming. They have had a more Kentucky flavor. Brad Montel did a lot of the proposing from Shelby County, but now he's been promoted to some big job, and he's making getting his high 3 with it. They all hate, right? But I really think it's going to be probably more ALEC, because now they've got 64 votes in the House of Representatives, so they can really do whatever they want. And I think what's so important is for all of us and to have this information to bring forward to talk about public charter schools and transparency and accountability, and really have them on record, and make sure that local school districts and school boards have the authority to approve or disapprove of them. So, but we don't know what they're going to do now, because who knows?
So nothing's been refiled.
I haven't seen anything yet. I looked today, there wasn't anything. And you're absolutely right, Stephanie, right? Because there's like 10 legislators that have any educational background that are going to make decisions on really really crisis, really important education issues. Of course, they don't care. You know, they make healthcare decisions for women all the time. They don't care. They don't care.
I would just say if anybody wants to see the ALEC agenda, it's there on their website. You can look it up. You can Google it. It's there. Yes.
And it's the American Legislative, say it for everybody again. American
Legislative Exchange Council.
Right, okay.
And yes, yeah, last couple little comments just with regard to this is that, so there is an opening for them to do something different than what they were doing now that they have all houses and so forth. So that would be, I think, one of the things we ought to strategically look for. And if we see it, I would say, why is it that you're going with something that's so not like Kentucky? You know, and really call them back to at least start from the bills they have been looking at, which are more authentic and homegrown. When ALEC comes in, and the reason you didn't have a lot of that last year is why would they? They're going to go to states where they can ram their stuff through. But now that they can ram their stuff through, my guess is we'll see them here. But here's the thing. They often put people in compromising situations. So this is where we have to go and talk with our Republican legislators and try to get them to be true to Kentucky, true to kids, true to these purpose parts of public education and so forth, because it's going to be hard for some of them if ALEC comes in, because what they do is they go and they say, if you do this, more money will follow for your elections,
money in politics.
right? And if you don't, we'll primary you.
Right.
So I just want people to know that that's the environment, which is therefore why we really do have to build relationships with folks on both sides of the aisle in this case, because some of them are going to have to take what I will call now courageous stands if things come through, and we're going to have to say, how will we do this? And hopefully at least a little bit of my talk with the stuff in Iowa is that it doesn't have to go all crazy terrible if you have charters. If you can say, well, this is not because we have charters, we have public schools that are innovative, and we have public charters, but they have to be public.
All right, Yvonne, next question.
What are accessibility procedures to assure equity? How will disability educators be addressed in light of laws? And how will attribution
Say, if you do this, more money will follow for your elections,
Money in politics.
right? And if you don't, we'll primary you.
Right.
So I just want people to know that that's the environment, which is therefore why we really do have to build relationships with folks on both sides of the aisle in this case, because some of them are going to have to take what I will call now courageous stands if things come through, and we're going to have to say, how will we do this? And hopefully at least a little bit of my talk with the stuff in Iowa is that it doesn't have to go all crazy terrible if you have charters. If you can say, well, this is not because we have charters, we have public schools that are innovative, and we have public charters, but they have to be public.
All right, Yvonne, next question.
What are accessibility procedures to assure equity? How will disability educators be addressed in light of laws? And how will attrition, how will attrition be addressed?
Who wants to start?
Well, it's a fact that in charter schools, teacher turnover rates are much higher than in a traditional public school.
2 to 3 years on average.
And it's also a fact that students with disabilities tend to be eased out of charter schools if they don't perform as their same age peers. It's a travesty. It's not right, but it happens every day all over the U.S.
I'd like to add one little thing with that. There is a chain of charter schools in New York City called Success Academy. headed by a formidable woman named Eva Moskowitz. And Eva, oh, I'm sorry, louder and with feeling? Okay. There is a chain of charter schools in New York City called Success Academy. You may have seen them in Waiting for Superman. Well, they are not all that in a bag of chips, and I'll tell you why in a moment. For years, the head of that, Eva Moskowitz, said, we do not cherry pick. We're just so great that our schools are better. And if I can be my vulgar self, she must have pissed off the wrong person. Because somebody leaked to the New York Times last year a list whose title was, I couldn't make this up, Kids Who Must Go. And that's exactly what you think it is. The New York Times checked it out, and the students they were able to track down, every one of them had been eased out. Just say.
Susan, any comment on that question?
I think the special ed questions are going to be quite intense. There's a huge problem with working out funding for special needs. When you have a school district, you have a pool. And if this school gets the high need student, the resources are coming from the district to meet those added needs. You can't quite do a funding formula for a school with 100 or 200 kids and have enough to support a few kids with high needs. I have seen in the Tennessee legislation, they just said, you're just going to have to work with your school district. So the district went on having the resources. And if the charter school had a kid with special needs, the district was at the table to formulate the whole IEP.
And that's the argument that they have with parents is, oh, well, if you feel like you're not getting the service for your child at our school, your local public school has lots of resources for your child and their type of disability. Why don't you try your local public school? And that's where they end up coming back to.
All right, next question, be done.
We hear about charter schools being private, but all of them aren't. Many are public. So why are we leading folks to believe they are mostly unsuccessful? Well, many of our public schools are not successful. All of the negatives can be found in some public schools. So why aren't we looking at charters? Why are we looking at charters differently?
Okay, because they're making a profit.
So the one thing I would say to that is that there are absolutely bad hospitals, there's bad doctors, there's bad teachers, there's bad schools. That's just a fact of any profession, any place you go. Bad lawyers, bad judges, whatever. Pick your profession, right? But our product is human capital. That's what we produce. It's a very heated subject. Parents bring us the best they got. And we as educators have to do the best we can with what we got. And in places where schools are deemed failures, I would challenge you to go and ask questions about what resources are available to that school. What opportunities are available to that place? And then go to a successful, my air quotes, go to a successful school and ask what kind of resources and opportunities that school has. I've worked in both places, and I can tell you there are vast differences in district support, and believe me, I've never taught in Jefferson County, so I'm not talking about JCPS, although I'm sure somebody could. But I'm talking about in my school district, the district support for the two schools where I worked was vastly different. The PTA in the first school I worked at brought in over $100,000 a year. I was given a Walmart gift card at the beginning of the year with $500 on it. At the school where I worked and ended my career before I took this job, the PTA had 5 members.
Shawnee?
There were no fundraisers because none of our families could afford to buy any fundraising. We had to write grants or it came out of my pocket. All 8 years I taught at that school that was the lowest performing school in the district, every year on my taxes, I spent more than $1,500 a year on my classroom. Because I was not going to have my kids go without. It's vastly different. That's the conversation we need to be having.
And I want to add one more thing about why charter schools are different, depending on how your law is. You are unhappy with your, let's make it easy. You're an elementary school parent, and you are unhappy with your child's school. So you run for the SBDM, and you join the PTA, and you hassle your child's principal day and night. Now, your child doesn't go to a public school. Your child goes to your child goes to a for-profit charter school. There's no SBDM. The board that runs that the meetings aren't open to the freaking parents. That is true in a number of states. You can't even go to the freaking board meetings. You know what? Because it's run by a for-profit management company. The meetings of the nonprofit school, where they just tell you what's been decided behind closed doors, you can pack that with 500 people. Because you know what? The needle's broken and the damage is done, and you can't say a thing about it. Parents have no say at their own kid's school. You know why? Because those decisions are made by for-profit management schools like the one that guy in Florida champions. And you have no say.
All right. I'm going to have to address the question of not painting our public schools as all we actually want them to be. Because we are living with horrendous achievement gaps. We are making very little progress on lifting students who are in those achievement gap groups. We are in fact seeing the gaps get bigger on a whole set of metrics. That's the thing I normally do for the Pritchard Committee. And I don't mean that that's an argument for charter schools. I mean that we shouldn't be speaking of public schools without letting that ache and without being sure we know what we're going to do in the next week to work on that too. In the Pritchard Committee's Achievement Gap Study Group, the number that knocked me over was when I figured out that we had an in-school suspension for every African-American kid in the state. Not that every kid has been suspended, but the number was big enough that if we'd spread them out evenly, every kid could have been suspended. And I don't see how that doesn't radiate out to kids who are not being suspended that their classmates are disappearing. I don't think we should talk about public schools as all that, because part of what we want in our hearts, we're not delivering with our muscles yet. And I do want to say that before the charter schools aren't the solution gets away to, and public schools are all we want, because none of us actually think that, and I just felt like I had to say that much before we just
So for me, I'd like to take that argument though a little bit deeper, because I think the focus on test score gaps, which are really not achievements, the focus on test score gaps has been part and parcel of the same thing with regard to making all schools be painted in certain ways. So I'm going to stay true to what I said before about the focus on the public and the development of human beings and citizens. All schools should be focused on developing human beings and citizens and be public and accountable in deep ways, far beyond the results of test scores. So, which then creates a false appearance. See, I said don't focus on the results with regard to the ones that have been put up there so much, but focus on all the other whole spectrum of things, which can include results, but they better be about, what about the rich curriculum gap? What about the notion of developing strengths and talents and having kids be able to have the kinds of learning environments that no matter what your income, right, being exposed to teachers who actually are certificated and so forth. But so my point is that I really think we have to look at what our purpose is in all public schools, hold all schools accountable for those things, and then literally create a more kind of a comprehensive way that we look at how well a school is doing. And then if they're going to be a charter school, they have to do that too. The problem of posing them as separate is this. At least with public schools, I can go to them and make that argument. If I then, my charter, my authorizer is no longer committed to those things, how can I now make that argument? So that's why I think charter schools are really a ruse, reacting to real things that are problems in our schools. I'm not trying to ignore those at all. I'm trying to say we need to commit to solving all those kinds of problems and not just look at the test score results and say something's good or bad based on that.
So Susan, let me ask you this question then. It seems to me the question is that there were, charter schools were put out here as ways to take care of all these problems in the public schools. And that's where some of this negativity has come, whereas it sounds like from what you're saying, because they were public in Iowa, they were not trying to take everything away from the public schools. They were just trying to be innovative and try to do a better job wherever they were.
Because they were made to be part of the public schools. They were part of those schools.
I think that's an important origin question. So I need to mention the years I served in the Reagan administration. This was an interesting thing to explain in my family, in case I don't radiate progressive stuff. But in those years, I was assigned to write a manual on parent choice of schools. And the two people I was sent to work with were Joe Nathan at the Hubert Humphrey School of Public Policy in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Charles Glenn, Director of the Bureau of Equal Educational Opportunity for the state of Massachusetts, Michael Dukakis governor. Those were the two. Those two guys were at the 92 meeting where people said, we need ways to have new kinds of public schools. We're going to call them charter schools. So the starting energy wasn't all right-wing. The sweep in of market theory privatizers has been vast since then. But the starting ideas were innovation. The starting ideas were opening up some new possibilities. I usually call it was the hippie theory. We want 1,000 flowers to bloom. The charter movement doesn't look like many different kinds of flowers blooming anymore. It looks like a few small variations. And I think it's important to see that the hope that there was an innovation just waiting to happen doesn't show up in most places, though it does show up for some urban systems and for African American students and low-income students, and we shouldn't walk away from that. If we want to say we don't think charters are the solution, it's time to bring it on what else are we going to do that's going to get something different. And that includes if we want to look at other features than the ones we can measure easily, which I agree with, we should bring that too.
We should bring it.
Right. And that I think is a really important challenge when you're worrying about charter schools, is don't let that pull you away from vision for each child.
So to clarify too, then there are public charter schools and then there are private charter schools. Is that, can we?
No.
Yeah.
No.
No,
because
if you ask Alec, they call them all public charter schools. Because
they're
the
getting
public
money.
because they suck at the public nibble.
Okay, but let's start out at the top. So starting at the top, there would be private charter schools, public charter schools.
They call them all public, even when they are run by
They call them charter unless they're getting money.
No, wait. Public charter schools, private charter schools, But then the question is, where does the money come from?
That's right.
Oh. That is right.
It's
So that's,
public
I'm just
money.
trying to
It could be
lay
just
it
private
out so
schools.
that when you ask the questions,
not
you
public
understand.
money.
It's just a regular private school.
Yeah.
They're called
It
private
could
schools,
be a
not
public
private
charter
charter
school
schools.
that's getting public money. Or it could be, the Iowa plan, but it could be a private charter school that's getting public money.
No,
No, it
but-
can be,
but-
yes. There are,
There are for-profit charter schools where the only input from the public is when you write a check.
okay, but the
You
question
can't
is,
go to their
though,
meetings, you can't influence what they do there, not even the parents.
but can you be a private charter school in some state and get public money?
Yes.
Yes. And then separate from
vouchers.
that would be a for-profit,
That's what most of them are.
private charter school.
It's pretty much the same thing.
Yeah.
Well, if it's for-profit, but they wouldn't necessarily get money from the state?
If they're a
In
charter
several
school, they get money from the state.
In several states, you can have for-profit charter schools. That's why there's these big chains that make millions.
Yes.
Publicly funded, but they are for-profit. They skim the top.
So if there's no public funds, it's just a private school?
Yes, yes.
Right, so
Which leads to this question: are the problems with the charter schools because they are run by for-profit groups? My answer would be yes.
Alright, well, Susan,
Although even nonprofits have problems.
Yeah.
Because of the variation in governance, the for-profit sector is relatively small. I'm trying to remember if I've seen research that separates out the for-profit. There's strong research on cyber charters, which just
Oh my
says
God.
they just
Suck
yeah,
the money
actually, that's
and
really
give
all
you
need to
nothing in
hear.
return.
Right. Cyber charters have been failing with impressive consistency.
K-12 is like the worst.
It's kids stay at home with a computer.
And they still get the same per pupil allocation as a brick and
That's
mortar.
a really tough one. I don't trust my memory that the studies that have separated out kinds of governance show a difference between for-profit and non-profit charter organizers. I think it tilts to the nonprofits have a little advantage because it wasn't big enough for people to use that as the proof that we shouldn't go there.
either one of you? Alright, next question, you got another one?
Why are we considering private charter schools when many charter schools are public? Why are we talking about the underachievement of some charter schools, but we aren't talking about underachieving public schools? What we need to do is to explore how we can solve underachievements,
Regardless of where,
regardless of where.
regardless of where. Okay.
How do we, as the League of Women Voters, put racial justice in the forefront of the fight against charter schools?
The NAACP has recently said they're.
Yeah, the NAACP has recently called for a moratorium on charter schools.
Right.
The NAACP on a national level.
It's in, the NAACP, press release is in your report.
Yeah, right, and then put it off on them.
I think that.
That's what we're saying.
Any comment on any of that?
I would just say that it's not any one person's responsibility. It's all
Yeah.
of our responsibility to make sure that social justice is, well, I mean, I believe this to my core, but there are many people in our world who do not believe in social justice, but I believe that every child should have an equal opportunity for a quality public education in Kentucky or anywhere else in the world. And if I can't use my white privilege to speak up for people who are oppressed, then I am not doing my job, I feel like personally, as a citizen of this great United States.
All right, let me say this, as president, I would invite those of you who are interested to do, you can do two things. You can join the Charter Schools Committee, and you can join the Education Committee, right, Brian? We have an Education Committee, so, obviously, there's lots of work to do. I think we need to thank these,